Liz. Liz Moore is a novelist and professor of creative writing at Temple University, originally from Massachusetts, and for whom writing is actually a second career. She was first a singer-songwriter, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Long Bright River was an instant New York Times bestseller and is Liz's fourth novel. It's partly a murder mystery. That's sort of the bones of the story, but it's mostly a story of sisters, the choices we make and have made for us, trust and redemption. It takes place in Kensington in 2017 at the height of the opioid epidemic, which we are still in the midst of. It's a beautiful book. It is also pretty heart-wrenching and ultimately hopeful. So well worth the read if you haven't read it already, and hopefully this will entice you too. Liz, I would love to start by having you read a little bit from the book, if you could, and maybe show it to us.
Sure,
you have it in front of you?
This is Long Bright River. I guess it's backwards on the screen, which happens.
No, we can see it.
Okay, it's backwards on my screen. Yeah, so here it is. Before I read, I like to give just a very short overview to orient people who haven't had the chance to read it yet. Long Bright River is the story of two sisters. Mickey is the older and Casey is the younger, who grow up adjacent to Kensington here in Philadelphia. Mickey, the older, is a police officer who prides herself on being very law-abiding and very morally upright. Her younger sister, Casey, at the start of the novel, is suffering from addiction to heroin and opioids and doing sex work to fund her addiction. The sisters are estranged, but they have a very strong bond forged by a very difficult childhood. And so when Casey goes missing at the same time that a string of murders is occurring in Kensington, Mickey takes it upon herself to go looking for her on the job, but also off the job, which gets her into some trouble. So the book is written in the first person from Mickey's point of view. So I'm going to read a very short passage, less than, I think, 5 minutes, from Mickey's point of view. And I should apologize in advance if you hear any children in the background. Those are my children, and I have only so much control over them. My husband is doing the best that he can.
No need to apologize. Happy to have them.
Strange times right now. Okay. If anyone likes to follow along while I read, this is on page 66, right after a line break. Officially, Casey and I no longer speak to one another. We haven't for 5 years. There have been rare occasions since then, 3 to be precise, when I have been required to interact with her at work, in my capacity as an officer and in her capacity as a suspect. And during each of those times, I have conducted myself with dignity, as any professional would, either processing her or releasing her, as I would do for any offender. To her credit, she too has conducted herself respectfully. When it is necessary to do so, I gently place handcuffs on the wrists of my sister, and I tell her the particular offense for which she is being arrested, usually solicitation and possession of narcotics, one time with intent to sell. And then I narrate her rights to her, and then I place a gentle hand on the crown of her head to ensure that she doesn't obtain an injury as she enters the back seat of our vehicle. And then I quietly close the door, and then I drive her to the station, and then I book her. And then the two of us sit silently across from one another in the holding cell, not speaking, not even looking at each other. Truman, who is Mickey's longtime partner who's out on medical leave at the start of the novel, Truman was with me each time, and each time he too remained silent, watching the two of us guardedly, his eyes darting back and forth from me to Casey to me again, waiting to see what would happen. That was the weirdest thing I've ever seen, he said, as we were driving away after the first of these episodes. I shrugged and didn't reply. I suppose it would look weird to someone who doesn't understand the particulars of our history and the tacit agreement we've come to in recent years. I've never tried to explain it to Truman or anyone else. You look out for her, he said another time. When I demurred, he continued, you would have been done with patrol years ago if you weren't out here keeping an eye on your sister. You would have taken the detective exam. I told him that this was not, in fact, true. It's just that I've grown fond of the neighborhood and have grown to care a great deal about its well-being. And also I find the history of the neighborhood interesting, and I like to watch it as it grows and changes. And lastly, it's never boring. On the contrary, it's exciting. Some people do have trouble with Kensington, but to me the neighborhood itself has become like a relative, slightly problematic but dear in the old-fashioned way that word is sometimes used, treasured, valuable to me. I am invested in it, in other words. And I'll stop there.
So why did you choose that particular passage to read?
Well, I think it sets up a good overview of the dynamic between the sisters, which is certainly fraught, but also very loyal. Mickey is a problematic first-person narrator. She's unbelievable in certain ways. I'm going to try very hard not to spoil anything throughout the course of the book, but not everything she says can be taken at face value. And she has this understanding of herself as sort of like the good sister, and she understands Casey to be the sort of like messed up sister. And obviously both of those understandings become complicated throughout the course of the novel. And I think what's interesting to me is that about, the way that a lot of people I've spoken to talk about Kensington is it's a similar thing. Like there's a great loyalty to the neighborhood. And there's also a recognition that a lot of different systems have failed the neighborhood. And so it's experiencing a lot of different problems that go hand in hand with that. So the neighborhood is a character in the book, and Casey is a character in the book, and Mickey feels kind of similarly, I think, about both entities.
So tell me a little bit about, so this is the first of your books that you set in Philly, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a part of Philly that is often overlooked, perhaps intentionally. And so what drew you to Kensington in particular and to the stories you told there? And how did you, as a newcomer, how did you sort of navigate that and figure out how to tell the story?
So, yeah, my personal history with Philadelphia is that my husband's family is from this area, and also Wilmington, Delaware, which makes a cameo in the book. And so when I met him, we always talked about Philadelphia as a place we might live. And we moved here together in 2009. Actually, for my job, I got a fellowship at Penn to teach and live there for a year. And then I ended up getting full-time work up in the Northeast at Holy Family University, teaching creative writing. So we sort of stayed because of me, even though my husband was the one with more of a family history in this area. So I've been here for 11 years now. And in some ways it does feel like my permanent home. We live here, have no intention to leave. We're raising kids here, both of whom were born here. And then in other ways, I feel like I will forever be a newcomer to Philadelphia, even though this is the place I've lived for longest as an adult, certainly. And it's starting to rival even my hometown as I get older and older. At a certain point, it will be the place I've officially lived the longest. But in terms of Kensington itself, I was first brought to the neighborhood the very first summer I lived in Philadelphia back in 2009 by the photographer Jeffrey Stockbridge. Many of you may be familiar with his project Kensington Blues. He is a friend of my sister-in-law's. And he heard I was a writer, and he was making portraits of the neighborhood, both the infrastructure of the neighborhood and some of the residents of the neighborhood. And he wanted somebody to accompany him to take the histories of his subjects. And so I didn't go up with him many times. I would say I went probably 6 times with him or something like that. Mm-hmm. But that was my first introduction to Kensington in the summer of 2009. In 2009, Kensington in Philadelphia was certainly known as a place that was being hard hit by the opioid crisis, but the opioid crisis in general was not receiving the type of coverage it now receives in the news. And so I was surprised, I guess, to put it mildly, by what I saw. And I also have a long history of addiction in my own family. And so I had a kind of personal pull to the neighborhood to go back over and over again. Later, I wrote some nonfiction about the neighborhood, most of which was never published. And I began doing community work at St. Francis Inn. I taught free writing workshops at the Thea Bowman Women's Center, which was a women's day shelter. that unfortunately is on hiatus right now, but that's another long-standing organization housed within St. Francis Inn. So that's sort of the origin story of the novel. I began a short story that used the characters of Mickey and Casey, but put it aside in order to write my book, The Unseen World, and then return to it after The Unseen World was published, because I kept getting drawn back kind of over and over again to the characters in the neighborhood.
And did the characters, I mean, are they based on people you met in the neighborhood, or
No.
they just came to you?
Yeah, the characters are very much not based on anybody that I met in Kensington. They certainly share some things in common with a lot of people in Kensington, specifically the path into opioid addiction doesn't have that many variations scientifically or technically.
Yeah.
Typically opioid addiction begins with prescription medication, which turns into, when the prescription runs out, opioid medication is purchased. Then when it becomes clear how expensive opioid medication is, many people turn to heroin as a more affordable alternative. And so, that arc is detailed in the book, but although Casey shares that arc with many people, it's not, she is not based on any one person.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you touched on this when you talked about why you read the passage, but the thing that struck me, a few things struck me, but one of the things that really struck me about the book is the humanity of the people who it's really easy to not think of in those terms. And so, there's people who are using and selling drugs or selling themselves, the police, the people whose struggles that made them angry, and you very definitely showed them not being good or bad, or being both good and bad, or having depth to them that I think we don't necessarily want to see in people all the time. And so, and I don't want to spend a ton more time sort of talking about the situation in Kensington, but I would love to sort of ask you what you want people to know about that world that you were conveying in the book, and sort of what you think we should do. I know you've talked in the past about being in favor of safe injection sites, which is a thing that we've had a lot of hand wringing about. But what is your sort of take on it?
So I'm always sort of careful to say that as a fiction writer, I am not as much of a policy expert as people who actually make a policy. That said, as a human who's certainly, like, at this point spent a lot of time around addiction, I have thoughts about what might be helpful, including safe injection sites. I am in favor of safe injection sites and sort of harm reduction in a more general sense. And obviously holding pharmaceutical companies accountable is a positive thing, and probably a useful thing to do. What I hope people get out of the book is, it's difficult right now, I think, and you're probably familiar with this, there's a lot of discourse around whether it's problematic for writers to come in and, like, quote unquote, humanize people who are already human beings. And I think I'm nervous about saying that the book humanizes anything, because, people in Kensington are already human.
Sure.
I think what my interest in as a writer is in telling a story that's complex, and certainly as a writer, it's never my task or my goal to paint anybody as all good or all bad. In this book, or in any of my other books, all of my characters, I hope, are both good and bad, which sort of comes up in the novel in one scene, because I think that's how all people are, good and bad both.
Yeah, and that was I take that correction. That was well put. So let's step back for a minute. I'd like to know a little bit more about you. I mentioned at the beginning that you started out as a singer-songwriter. And so how did you get from being a singer-songwriter to being a New York Times bestselling novelist? That is an unusual path.
So I feel like I need to be honest about the fact that I was not a particularly successful singer-songwriter. I never, made money off it. I played very small shows, mostly in New York, although in some other cities as well, at like a pretty, sort of like the same set of venues. But I loved it. I was pretty serious about it from my college years through my mid-20s, let's say. I guess I got into it because I loved music. And I played music as a kid and I sang as a kid. And I picked up guitar. I have an aunt who plays guitar, and she gave me my first guitar as a young teenager. And I sort of taught myself guitar, and then ended up working at a guitar store in the village during college as a weekend job, and met the people who would become my bandmates there, and just had fun playing for like, I don't know, 5 years pretty seriously. And I think the bridge from singer-songwriter to writer was that in college, I began taking a short story course. And the short stories I was writing were all about the music industry, because I was really interested in it. And I was meeting such interesting characters, sort of like playing gigs in New York. So it was a series of interconnected short stories about the music industry. Some have called it A Visit from the Goon Squad before A Visit from the Goon Squad was published.
Yeah.
Definitely a much less successful and much less polished A Visit from the Goon Squad. So that was my first book, called The Words of Every Song. And then from there, I sort of had to make the decision about whether that was going to be my sort of fluke of a novel about what I was already doing, or whether I was really serious about pursuing writing. And I would say I was not having enough success as a singer-songwriter to consider that seriously. And I was really growing to love writing short stories and writing longer works as well. And so I kind of I threw myself into that and sort of pulled back on the singer-songwriter stuff. And got my MFA and subsequently published a novel called Heft, which achieved a bigger readership, although still not huge. And then and that's all I've done since. I've taught creative writing, and I've written, and I'm quite content doing these things. And although I miss playing music sometimes, I have no real ambition to reintroduce it professionally. Yeah,
that's great. You teach writing to college students, and then you said you also been teaching at the Thea Bowman Center.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask you what if you approach it differently, or if you or not.
So yes, I teach. I've taught at a variety of institutions. I am currently on the faculty at Temple University in their MFA program in creative writing, and also I teach undergraduates there. And my work at the Thea Bowman Center was limited because the center went on hiatus. I don't want to speak for them about why. I believe that they had just reopened it, and then this happened, the stay-at-home order. So although St. Francis Inn is very much operating, I don't believe that the Thea Bowman Center is operating right now.
Oh, I thought it went on hiatus because of the coronavirus.
No, it had gone on hiatus slightly before that. Yeah. So sadly, I haven't taught there since I think 2018. But in terms of how I approached it and versus how I approach, my classes at Temple, there's not that much of a difference, to be honest. We start by reading model texts, and we discuss those, like published works. And then there's a period in which we discuss student work. At Temple, that's work that we've read in advance and then discuss, having prepared our thoughts. At the Thea Bowman Center, it would be, the students would have 10 or 15 minutes to respond. And I would typically organize it around a particular theme, such as change, or something that I hoped could be approached in a number of ways, because the last thing I wanted to do was extract something like painful that students didn't want extracted. I wanted to leave it open-ended so that if students wish to write about sort of a happy memory, that was certainly a possibility too. And then at Thea's, there was a period during which we all would share our work, either a picture or a response in the form of a picture or a response in the form of writing, and nobody had to share if they didn't want to. It was voluntary.
It sounds like it was probably really moving to work.
Yeah, it was very moving and I hope interesting to the students as well. Yeah, I still think about them a lot.
So you, I think I read that you maybe moved to Philadelphia, or at least it sounds like you were here earlier, but you got a new job and had 2 babies in the process of writing this book. Yeah. So how do you do that? How do you manage to actually?
That's a really good question right now as we are quarantined in our houses. I would say, gosh, I want to be really honest and not. Okay, during regular life, I have to answer this in 2 different ways. During regular life, I rely, and this comes up a lot in Long Great River, on a variety of people who provide me with childcare. It's extremely important for me to say that. Both grandparents, my kids are lucky enough to have 4 living grandparents, and so they provide a lot of support so that I can do my writing, and also their daycare. Where there are like really wonderful creative people employed to care for my children so that I can write. Now I don't have that. And so what my husband and I are attempting to do is just kind of like, he has a very, very busy job with very inflexible hours. Although he's working from home, he's sort of on work calls all day long. So he attempts to carve out like 1 or 2 hours during a work day so that he can take over with the kids and I can do my writing. And I do nothing else. Like, it's very tempting during those 1 or 2 hours a day to clean the house or exercise or do any of the other, like shower, any of the other things that people normally do with their days. But I sort of say writing has to come first, and I just write, and to the detriment of the house and my personal hygiene.
But the benefit of the rest of us. Right. But you can just write in sort of 1 or 2 hour chunks, and then it's like like punching a time clock.
Yeah, it's not ideal. I prefer 4 hour blocks. I'm very like persnickety about how I write in normal life. But I can't be right now. And so I just attempt to take the 1 or 2 hours I have and make something. If I write 250 words during those 1 or 2 hours, I feel a sense of relief.
Wow. So you're working on another book?
Yep. In theory. Yes.
Wow. Yeah. So I would love to get some other people up here to ask some questions. So Shadman, if you want to call somebody up here, I will ask you. I'll ask you one other question while we're waiting for somebody to come up here. So I wonder if you can explain the title of the book, Long Bright River.
So the title of this book came very late in the process for me. I had a very bad working title that I won't share aloud for the entire writing process. And I knew that it wasn't working. And my agent confirmed for me that it wasn't working. So before we sent it out to editors, I sort of like cloistered myself in my room for a whole work day back when that was a possibility in life. And looked through every text I could find that related to addiction in any way. So I looked at poems and songs and stories and nonfiction, and came across this poem by Tennyson called The Lotus Eaters, which it narrates through the use of Greek mythology, the story of opium eaters, as they were called. So obviously, like, addiction to opioids has come in waves throughout most of modern history. But anyway, in that poem is the phrase "long bright river," and I loved it immediately, both for the kind of feeling it conjures and the way I think it must feel to be under the influence of opium medication or heroin. And also because it has so many other connections. Both it has a connection to the Delaware River, which plays a big role in this book and in the history of Kensington. At one point, it crops up in reference to a vein in an arm.
And
at
at least a couple times, right? Yeah.
You might remember better than I do. I think the vein comes up once, but then it also comes up in reference to a sort of long list of names of basically the departed, people we've lost to opioid overdose, a long bright river of people.
So you went back in and inserted the line into the
Exactly.
book?
Yeah, I sort of like retrofitted it. But all those connections immediately sprang to mind. And I think that's how I knew it was the title for the book. All my titles kind of do a lot of different things or things in my books.
I now really want to know what the working title was. So we'll work on trying to get that out of you.
Yeah.
Richard here. We can only see half of you. There you are. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Richard.
Richard, for anybody who doesn't know, is the owner of Head House Books. So thank you so much for doing this with us.
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, good. It's never clear. Thank you, Roxanne. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Richard.
This is fabulous. I'm so proud to be a part of this. So thank you very much for including us. And I love Liz's writing. For anyone, if this is their first experience with her work, I would certainly go back to Heft and Unseen World. And each one is so different. You're so skilled and you have such a breadth. It's amazing. So congratulations on all your success. And so I wanted to ask you about the nature of the relationship. You chose twins rather than childhood friends or siblings. And the sort of intentional choices, but the random outcomes that can sort of chart one's course, and they were so divergent. What is it about the nature of that relationship that you learned and that sort of informed the book in a way that no other relationship could? That's what I'm interested in.
Good question. Let me begin by saying that Head House Books is a wonderful community bookstore. It's my neighborhood bookstore where I order all of my books, and they have signed copies of Long Bright River right now. So if you have not yet gotten one, you should get your Long Bright River from Richard at Head House Books. And supporting indie bookstores in general is a good thing. Do that. As for your question, I have a very close relationship with my own sister. She's a lot younger than I am. There's a bigger age gap between us than there is between Mickey and Casey. And also, she wants me always to be very careful to say that she is not anything like Casey. She is a very functional type A person. But there is, my kind of love for her and my bond with her is probably quite similar to the bond between Mickey and Casey. I think there's something about the bond between sisters that's difficult to rival. And what always interests me about siblings is that, we grow up in the same household, often with the same parents, although not always. And yet so many sibling sets that I know are so different from one another. And certainly that has a bit to do with birth order and the circumstances of the family during the majority of each person's childhood. But also I think it just has to do with luck of the draw. The question of nature versus nurture comes up all the time in this book. And there are certain revelations that come out about the sisters that I don't want to ruin. But, I think it's difficult to determine which is the more important factor. But I think both of them are at play in this book and in life. Thanks, Richard.
Sure. Thanks.
So we have a number of other questions here with people who don't want to come on the screen. But a few people are wondering about the police work in the book. That I guess it felt real, and wondering if you had a background in police work or how you sort of managed to convey that.
I don't have a background in police work, and thank you for saying it feels real. I've certainly had other readers write in with critiques of the ways in which it does not feel real. To which I would say, in a work of fiction, I often kind of bend rules where necessary to tell a good story, and I had to on a couple of occasions in Long Great River. The way I did my research for the police work was a few different ways. I conducted my husband's friends with a police officer, and whose father is also a retired police officer. I did phone interviews with them. And I did a phone interview with a woman who's a police officer who I met through the website Quora. It was important to me to speak to a woman who had done police work to get that perspective. And probably the most helpful thing I did was I did a ride along with a member of the PPD here in Philly, who took me through. I requested a ride along within the district, specific to Kensington, but was granted a ride along in the district adjacent to that. So I wasn't in Kensington itself, but I was still able to accompany an actual member of the PPD and ask him questions for about 6 hours about what a typical day in the life and work of a member of the PPD would be like. So that was where most of my research came in, along with news articles.
Right.
And there's, again, not trying to give anything away, but doing research about sort of like news that related to the PPD was also important to me.
Right. So a couple of people would love to know, as would I, what some of your favorite authors or books are.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I buried the first part of that question, which is I have loved every one of your books. So I should make sure that I mentioned that they said that too.
That's great. Thanks for accompanying me from book to book, because I have the unfortunate habit of like writing in a completely different genre every time I write a book. Not completely different, but yes, I don't make it easy on readers in that sense. Some of my favorite authors and books include, I'll start with mysteries because this book is related to, I guess it's categorized as both a family drama and a crime drama. I love the classics. In high school, I read a ton of Agatha Christie. I loved Ngaio Marsh, who's a sort of classic mystery writer from New Zealand. Today, Ngaio. It took me a long time to learn how to say her name. I today really unsurprisingly love the work of Tana French. I've read, I think, every one of her books. And I like Dennis Lehane a lot. Being from Massachusetts, his books about Boston kind of feel quite familiar to me. In terms of non-crime novels, I would say that the work of Kazuo Ishiguro is extremely important to me as a writer. I love The Remains of the Day. I think his voice work in that is incredible. I really love, I went to Barnard, and so I'm very interested in authors who use voices that are non-standard in a way that doesn't feel contrived. So The Remains of the Day is an example of that. The work of Zora Neale Hurston is a good example of that, both in like her, the most recent, I guess, nonfiction field work that she did was the transcription of the voice of a person, a real person. And then her fiction, like Their Eyes Were Watching God, also uses unusual voice in a way that doesn't like jar me. I don't like certain writers who I won't name who use unusual voices in a way that feels like they're just showing off or it's contrived. That jars me too, but those are a few. I love short story writers. The work of Flannery O'Connor is very important to me. Edward P. Jones. Dubliners was extremely important to me in high school. That was like one of the first books I read that made me want to write short stories.
It's interesting. So they're pretty varied, but voice is the thing that attracts you to books. It sounds like.
I would say. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Um, so I'm going to ask a couple of these that are interesting to me too. A bunch of these are great questions. So somebody wants to know, and this is sort of a process question too, where which of the characters did you think of first? And this is sort of dovetails on a question I kind of had, which was if you had a favorite character in the book. So I guess the question was, did you come up with Casey or Mickey first?
I came up with Casey first. I would say, so back in, I think 2015 is when I wrote a short story that included both characters. And I was writing in the first person voice of Casey. And I could never find a first person voice for her that felt right or authentic. So I think that's the main reason I scrapped the short story and didn't pursue it further as a novel. But then when I arrived at Mickey as a character, I sort of found my way into the story through her because I probably share more in common with her personality-wise and autobiographically, and that enabled me to develop a voice for her that felt right. So the answer is Casey, but in a failed way. And then when I figured out kind of who Mickey was, that's when the book took off, or when I was able to write the full novel. Favorite character.
Actually, let me ask you a question about that. So yes. you weren't able to, and this sort of comes back to voice, you weren't able to come up with a voice for Casey that felt authentic at first. But then when you had Mickey, were you able, did that sort of lead you to be able to come up with the right voice for Casey?
Well, Casey doesn't have a first person voice in the novel, right. So it's all told through Mickey's point of view. So I guess the answer is no, I never was able to find a first person voice for her. Yeah. But the fact that she's absent for most of the novel means that, she's, it's Mickey's story, I guess, more than Casey's, although Casey's conundrum is at the heart of the book.
Right. Did you have a favorite character?
Who do I like? I kind of like a bad guy character. I like Ahern. I think he's like, I know people like him. He's the sergeant who's kind of like a bit insecure and kind of difficult to be around, and probably not a very good boss. And I don't know. I guess I had fun writing him, even though he's kind of a bad guy. And I should say I'm noticing the comments that people are making in this box over here, and thank you. I'm reading them. They're very kind.
So a couple of people are wondering about Ballmer Coffee, which is the kind of hipster coffee shop in the book. And is that based on anything in the neighborhood in particular?
No, I mean, it's based on like every hipster coffee shop in Philadelphia, by the way, which I like go to and frequent. So I'm not excusing myself. But I guess I'm interested in class disparities and the way small things can signify big class differences. I've always been interested in that. And certainly that comes up in the book a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you described the hipster coffee shop super well, right? I recognized it from my neighborhood, which is not Kensington.
Right.
So this is an interesting question, because we talked a little bit about how you got to know Kensington today, or whatever it was, a few years ago. Mm-hmm. But somebody is wondering how you managed to capture Fishtown and Port Richmond in the 90s and early 2000s, saying that I think this person grew up there and felt like you captured it well. So how did you do that?
Some research. A lot of my students at Holy Family came from Port Richmond, Alney, like the sort of a lot of parts of the greater Northeast. And I got to know them pretty well. So I just sort of in passing heard about those neighborhoods. Also, my husband was actually quite useful in, he played sports growing up, and he often played basketball in a variety of neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and so has memories of the 90s in like a lot of the neighborhoods that that I was describing. And other than that, it's just, I guess, research. You know, you talk to enough people who grew up in and around those neighborhoods, and they're pretty good resources for specific memories or specific like businesses or actually that's when it becomes extremely important to have people you can ask things of, because you know, no amount of Googling will tell you the name of like the thrift shop that people would go to. It would, you know, you can kind of find what thrift shops were there or existed, but like not which ones people would go to.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, is that level of detail you can't get. Mm-hmm. So there's in the book, this is another question here that Mickey in particular has, I mean, I guess they both have mentors, though not all of them for either of them are the best kind, but they had real adult figures who shaped them and the women that they became. And I'm wondering if you had particular mentors that you can talk about.
Definitely. My mentors were different. I have to be very certain to differentiate them from the mentors, especially in Mickey's life. Obviously, she had an extremely problematic mentor, and I'll stop there. But I was a kid who just like idolized a lot of my teachers, especially like English and creative writing teachers. And, you know, would go out of my way. Like, I really wanted to make my teachers happy and make them proud, which is like very Mickey-ish of me, I guess. But I can still think of like a lot of the teachers who really kind of took an interest in me as a kid and in my writing, up through college. You know, I actually began college as a science major, but it was through a combination of not doing that well in my science courses and taking at least 2 English or creative writing courses where I had professors who said, like, you know, you seem like well suited to this, that drew me over to the dark side of English and creative writing.
Oh, great. Catherine is asking, did recently having children inform the way you wrote about the relationship between Thomas and Mickey? And do you think you would be able to write about it in the same way before being a mom?
So all 3 of the novels I published prior to this, I think were primarily told from the perspective of, I think of a divide between, you know, once I had kids, I felt all of a sudden like I had crossed a divide. Before I had kids, I was writing from the perspective of the child always, even adult children. Like in my book, Heft, the main character is 58 years old, but he still sort of identifies as a child. He's very engaged with the memory of his parents, and same with The Unseen World. I write about a girl who becomes a woman. So the span of her life, her entire life, from the time she's born up until she's an adult. But again, only at the very end of that book does she have children. With Long Bright River, you know, Mickey has a kid right up from page 1, and he consumes all of her energy, all of her love, all of, you know, it's just an inescapable part of her life. And when I began writing Long Bright River in earnest, I had just had a baby. So that was a huge part of my life. And the battle to find childcare was a huge part of my life. And it has been pointed out that childcare in this book is like as much a source of tension as like finding out where a missing person is. And that feels real to me. True. You know, I especially right now, like when I would pay like so much money to, you know, just have access to any form of childcare. You know, it's a sense of almost like desperation when you're so tired. And, you know, Mickey works odd hours too. So it's a much huger concern for her than it ever was for me prior to COVID and quarantine. Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because I mean, she is also very much a child still too. I mean, meaning that she's an adult who thinks a lot about her parents and grandmother. And so it's not that you've stopped writing about that, it's that
Right.
now there's this other element to it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the book begins and ends with lists of names that you come to very quickly understand as the reader are the names of people who have died from an overdose. And somebody is wondering something I think probably occurs to all of us, which is, are those the names of real people?
No, they're not. They are invented names. No doubt there are people with those names because they're kind of like a generic list of Irish American and Polish American names.
Yeah.
But they are not real names. I mean, they're not real people that I know.
Did anybody ever tell you that you happened to put their name in it? That would be strange.
Not yet. No, not yet, but maybe. I received I think somebody wrote to me once about a different character in another one of my books, with whom they shared a name and a lot of other weird life circumstances. So it may yet happen. Yeah.
That's weird.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard from a lot of readers? I mean, this book seems like it would, as do all your books, that they would touch people. And you can tell a little bit from the comments here that people feel like they are, that you're explaining something that they understand about their own lives. Have you heard people tell you that for this book?
I've heard from a lot of readers, and before quarantine, I was able to do sort of like the first half of my book tour in person. And there I had the very meaningful experience and also very sad experience of meeting with a lot of readers in person who had themselves struggled with addiction or were struggling with addiction, or also had lost family members to addiction. And that was an incredibly powerful experience, and also difficult in the sense that a lot of times that would happen at the end of an event, and typically there's a sort of a signing line that happens where a bookseller is sort of like inviting people through, and somebody would share something incredibly personal. And I felt always like those conversations were abbreviated in a painful way. So when I could, I would sort of try to exchange information with them so that we could continue the conversation, but sometimes it didn't happen. And I'm still thinking about, like, I wonder how that person is doing.
Wow. Did you follow up with some people, or did they follow up with you?
Yep. A couple of times we had email exchanges after the fact. But I think, it's kind of a testament to just how widespread opioid addiction is. It is rare for me to meet a person who has not been touched in some way by it.
Yeah. So can you tell us, there's a couple more questions about the book. One of which is the character of Truman, which you can sort of explain briefly, I guess, to people who might not have read the book. So how did he come to you, and what was let me see how to phrase it. Was there something about him that you felt was really key to the story? Why is he there?
So I think Mickey has a lot of mentors. Truman is her police mentor. He's the first partner she has. He was tricky because my research has told me that it is becoming increasingly rare for police to even be partnered anymore, partly due to budget reasons. A lot of people don't, in cop movies, you see like, oh, they're partners. They've been partners for years. It still happens sometimes, but it's not that common. So I sort of had to make this strange, like, aside about why they were partners and whatnot. I think Truman and Mickey respect each other. I think they're both sort of like odd ducks and outsiders a little bit. And they respect each other in the sense that, like, neither one of them pries too deeply into the other one's life. Truman's a bit older than Mickey, and for that reason, she sees him as a mentor and potentially, problematically, as a father figure. I think she's always looking for kind of parent figures because she didn't have strong ones herself. And she ends up putting Truman in a difficult position. And that is maybe further testament to the idea that she is a problematic character, despite all of her protests about herself and her sense of herself as like morally upright. She still, in the end, kind of like betrays a person who has been incredibly kind to her and has helped her a lot in life. And I'm towing the line without, I'm trying not to spoil anything, but yeah, he was a complicated character for me. He's got his own stuff going on. I mean, his personal life is kind of complex throughout the novel too. So Mickey ends up making it like more complex and harder in a way.
I thought he was interesting because you talked about her being kind of an unreliable narrator, and he provided a window into that for us, her relationship with him.
In his reactions to what she was saying and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us what the next book is about?
I tend not to talk about my work in progress, partly because it just like knocks the wind out of my sails. And if I talk about it, I don't want to write it anymore. I will say that I am attempting to include an element of suspense, although it's a bit different on the surface than Long Bright River. But also I have to remind myself that like all of my books, except The Words of Every Song, have included a kind of mystery, whether it's, you know, a question about identity or ancestry or something like that. So, you know, although this was the first book I wrote that can be called a crime drama, it's always been my instinct as a writer to include something for readers to figure out. And I think my next book will be no different.
That's great. I think there's one last question, which is really about, it's a style question, which is that you didn't put quotes around when people spoke. Is that just a style for you, or was there something deliberate about that in Mickey's voice?
It was deliberate, and it's funny, when I made that choice, I could not have anticipated how much it would come up in conversation. It's probably the question I'm asked the most, interestingly. Wow. I'm not certainly not the first author to do it. There's a kind of long tradition of using, I guess they're end dashes, to get really geeky about it, before dialogue. Beginning, well, I don't know if it's beginning, but you know, what I mentioned, Dubliners, James Joyce actually uses end dashes to set off dialogue, along with more contemporary writers like Roddy Doyle does that too. I would say for me, it has to feel right for the character. Not all my books do that. Heft used that a bit in one of the characters' voices. For me, if a character is lacking confidence in some way, or is a character I imagine speaking quietly and sort of mumbling, I don't like the look of quotation marks, because it feels like a big announcement when there's a line of dialogue. And with Mickey, I imagined her sort of like never wanting to, you know, she's quiet to begin with. Yeah. And I didn't imagine her speaking with this kind of like fanfare. It was more just like monotone, you know, here's the next thing that happened. I liked the somewhat quieter visual of the dash.
Oh, interesting. That's amazing that's the question you're asked the most, and it's great. Maybe those are people who are reading very closely, right?
Yeah, exactly, and interested in grammar, which I am too. So
yeah. So you mentioned that there's one last question here, that you started this as a short story. Are you interested in the form of short stories, or is that something that you are pursuing, would want to do a series of short stories?
Yeah, I have a number of short stories that I've written, some of which I've published. I have one right now that's kind of sitting there waiting until a moment when it feels right to send out a short story that is more about normal life than this life.
Yeah.
I tend to write like one long, complex short story in between novels, almost as like a palate cleanser before I really dive into something else. So that's what this short story I have sitting on the back burner is for me. It's like I needed to like clear my brain before I started another novel.
So they don't always, they don't necessarily inform what the next book is going to be. Like this,
not really. Occasionally,
like
I'll use them as like a testing ground, or like, you know, are these characters I could write about over the course of many more pages than this? But sometimes it just feels like they only want to be a short story, and that's what this one felt like. I always knew it would be a short story.
So I know you don't want to tell us what your new book is about, but can you tell me if if this experience that we're in right now is going to change what the book was originally intended to be?
That's a great question. I've talked a lot about it with my editor. I think a lot of writers are having this like moment of panic where we're all kind of like, what, the whole world is different. You know, who's going to want to read about like life as we knew it? The response is, well, who's going to want to read like 5,000 books about the coronavirus? You know, like,
right.
I think it's, although it feels interminable, at a certain point it will resolve in some way. And we can't have a crop of, you know, where every single writer writes about this exact thing. Certainly we can have a crop of novels that acknowledges the way in which the world has changed. And so I'm kind of trying to think about that instead of like writing something that's specific to this moment. It's more like acknowledging that the world feels a bit different and incorporating that in smaller ways.
So ways that a reader wouldn't necessarily know was referencing the pandemic, but that is informing something.
It's more stuff about theme, and you know, this book is the book that I'm writing. I don't even want to say this because it might not be true. It may be set in a different time. It may be partially set in a different time. It may be set, I don't know. But either way, it's like, you know, it doesn't necessarily, it won't be directly impacted by this. It might be indirectly impacted by this.
Okay, great. We've kept you from your children, who did a great job.
I'm thrilled to be kept from my children. Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us. Thank all of you for joining us, and to Head House Books, which I think still has some signed books, signed copies of Long Bright River that you can order.
And is it important to say you can order them, like if you just go to the Head House Books website? I believe when you order Long Bright River, there's a way to put a note in. If Richard is still there, you can type something in the chat box about how exactly to come by those signed copies. If not, I don't know, send him a note or something.
Yeah, that would be great. We look forward to reading your look forward to reading your next book. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, this is so nice. Wow, there's lots of comments. Cool. Thank you so much, Roxanne, for your questions and for hosting. This was a really nice event.
You're welcome. And thank you to all of you for joining us.
Cool. Bye.